Hello everyone and welcome to the Process Podcast.
Hello team, welcome back. It's me, solo, in my office today. Haven't done a solo podcast in a really long time. I used to do these ones quite a lot where I talk about a concept of coaching, or more specifically programming, which is something that I absolutely love within coaching. And I just ramble, talk, explore, share some thoughts. The reason I thought about this episode today was, the date today is the 24th of March. CrossFit Open finished a couple of weeks ago. And for many of my clients, athletes, and of course everyone involved in the process programming, that concluded the end of the 2021-2022 season. So we are now in a unique period of the year where we are unwinding, resting, and recovering from, of course, CrossFit Open number one, but also all the work that went in the lead up to CrossFit Open. It's that process of progression and overload is taxing on the mind and the body. And like every athlete in every sport, regardless of your level, if you've been persevering or pursuing a goal, it's really important that you follow that up with a period of rest and regeneration, or otherwise called a deload. So we're essentially deloading now. Of course, the quarterfinals are happening this weekend. So if you're listening to this after the fact, then the quarterfinals have happened. But the protocol is for our live and perform individuals, and that's what we're talking about today. Live, perform, compete training groups. They are going to be now deloading for 4 weeks. Now, what that means is that they are still training. Program is still provided, but not as much structure as we're perhaps used to. We're not really chasing any specific adaptations in particular. We are just moving, we are sweating, we're having some fun, we're doing some things different from what we've been doing in the whole lead up to the CrossFit Open. So breaking down variations of the Olympic lifts, different variations of gymnastics, plenty of bodybuilding, definitely some lower intensity aerobic work, giving our minds and bodies a chance to actually heal. For our compete athletes, those who qualify to quarterfinals, they will have a pretty aggressive 2-week deload post quarterfinals, where training will be really easy, and I'll be encouraging pretty much all of our subscribers to actually take some full time off, which means very little training or much easier training than what they're used to. So what we did yesterday as a team, got the process programming coaches together, and we sat down in front of a whiteboard like we often do every Wednesday, and I posed the question to the group, which was, team, the season has now ended, and I would like your feedback. As I am the person who more or less executes all the programming for the Live, Perform, and Compete groups, whilst I do get a lot of input at the start of each block, what we'll typically do at the start of each block is I'll ask for feedback from the team. I'll also ask for feedback from our affiliates who follow the program in their gyms, just for thoughts, things that went well, things that didn't go well. And I'll use that combined with kind of the overall plan of what I wanted to do anyway and build the next training cycle. But now this was a unique opportunity to do a full review of the year. And so what that reflection process looked like was essentially 2 parts. Firstly, we reflected on the CrossFit Open that had just happened. What did we learn from it? Was there anything different? Were we caught off guard? Did we prepare appropriately? And essentially, do we need to change anything for next season? And then the next part was, well, now let's look at the training year. So the training year is essentially from April 2021 to March 2022. Review that whole year. What did we do well? What didn't we do well? What would we change this year? How can we deliver it differently, and why? So that was the structure of the conversation. I tried my best not to really say anything actually, and just wanted the team to give me as much feedback. It was an awesome session, super productive, lots of great feedback of things that I hadn't actually thought of. Obviously I wrote my own little list of things that I'd like to improve on for next year, things I'd like to do differently, but the team came up with some really great points. And so what I'm going to do today is, after we've reflected on the CrossFit Open, I want to take you through what we're going to be changing for the Live, Perform, and Compete program this year. And if you have no idea what the Live, Perform, and Compete programs, I should say, well, there are online training programs. They're a group training program. That's a part of the process programming. Each of our 3 different groups, Live, Perform, and Compete, that's 3 programs, have their own set of goals and their own set of prerequisites. We essentially use the CrossFit Open as the training calendar every year. Even though for the Live program, the CrossFit Open is not a priority. Our Live program, we're training folks for health and longevity, exposing them to different movements they may see in everyday life. So with that, keeping muscle ups doesn't really have a place in the Live program, because I just can't see many times where an individual might have to swing on some rings and get themselves over it. But a lot of the functional or fundamental movements, I should say, of CrossFit are definitely incorporated in that program. But the difference is we're not pushing them to compete in anything. So we are definitely leaning more towards a health perspective. Whereas the Perform and Compete programs, those two programs are specifically focusing on wanting to take part in the CrossFit Open every year, as well as maybe other competitions throughout the year. So they are very much following more of a sport-specific program. With that said, of course, we're always going to err on the side of health versus performance. So we're basically trying to always find that fine line, that sweet spot between making sure that we're not taking away from short, medium, long-term health, but also we are progressing towards improving at the sport. And I've done plenty of episodes in the past where I talk about what that process looks like and how do we do it. So let's get back to the agenda today. First things first, reflections from the CrossFit Open. I posted some thoughts here on my social media, just sharing some thoughts on, I guess, what I thought of this year's tests, and generally, largely, I thought that I have very positive thoughts with the tests this year. But I think some main differences is that, well, firstly, in context, this is now the second year we've had where the CrossFit Open has been in this format, which has been a 3-week competition, and then followed by the quarterfinals, semi-finals, and the CrossFit Games. So leading into this year, we only had 1 year of historical data really to inform how we were going to prepare athletes for this season. That's obviously quite tough, because before this year we had 7, 8, 9 years of existing CrossFit Opens where every year there's a new set of tests and there's a new CrossFit Open. We're just adding to our database of knowledge as to what we might see next year, and we start to see trends like, okay, well, based on past years, these movements are always going to come up. These time domains are generally going to come up. We need to be good at doing these things. We probably don't need to be good at these things. And we have to be doing this for 5 weeks each year. Also, I have no idea how I was able to do the CrossFit Open for 5 weeks and also do each workout twice. Pretty crazy. Anyway, this time, obviously, it's changed quite significantly. Those of you listening will probably understand the changes now. Much shorter competition. We've got 3 weeks this time. Massive fan of that, personally. So what changed this year? Well, there was no max lift. First time in a really, really, really long time. There's only ever been one other year that I've taken part in the CrossFit Open where there hasn't really been like a max lift. And that was the year where we had that ascending deadlift ladder. I think that was 2014. I guess technically it still got pretty heavy, so it was a strength test of sorts, but there was no significant increases in load. And there was no expression or test of absolute strength or absolute strength speed, which would be something like an Olympic lift. So that changes things up. Time domains, when we looked at last year, we were looking at longer tests, kind of 10 to 20 minutes. This year, not too different, but we're looking more like 5 to 15 minutes. Last year we had 4 tests. This year we had 3 tests. Definitely more of an aerobic or a cardiorespiratory bias in terms of the tests this year. So less tests in terms of skill set or absolute strength speed, and more just breathing. Definitely as a whole, I think this year was a lot more inclusive. In terms of the high skill gymnastics, we did still see that in the last workout, but in terms of the volumes that we saw, much, much lower. We look at double unders, which showed up in that last workout as well. We've been seeing those in the excess of 300 reps each year. Now this year we had considerably less as well. So whilst there was still touches of gymnastics and higher skill movements, volume was much, much lower. So the question is, now we have 2 years and we have 2 kind of different looking years. What do we do next year? In my opinion, I think the way that we prepped our athletes for this year's CrossFit Open was really good. We definitely did quite a bit of fatigue-based strength testing as we led up to the Open. And of course, our athletes didn't have a chance to actually test that this year. But would I change that for next year? No, I think that we could definitely go back to 4 tests next year. We could definitely see a strength test come back next year. I think that was actually a missing component in the tests. So in terms of movement selection, and time domains. Really happy with how we prepared our athletes for the CrossFit Open this year, and I don't think I will change anything for next year. Okay, let's talk about the training year. So the training year, essentially, that lasted from April 2021, which is where we finished the CrossFit Open and the quarterfinals, and went all the way through to around March the 20th, 2022, this year when the CrossFit Open started. So the next question I posed to the team was, what can we do better? What didn't we like? What did we like? Please don't hold back with the feedback, which is something I always ask for, and let's just let it rip. So where do we start? My first bit of feedback when I thought about last year was that we needed more sport-specific intensification phases in the year. So what do we mean by intensification? So generally speaking, when we map out a training year, and let's say in this case it's kind of like 10 to 11 months, we've got some distinct training phases that we would lay in to a calendar. And we normally do this ahead of time. Doesn't mean we necessarily completely stick to it all year. We may make changes and adjustments as the year goes on. But generally speaking, our training, especially when preparing people for a competition, is going to fit within one of these 5 categories: accumulation, intensification, a pre-competition phase, a competition phase, and a deload or a deload phase. So what we do, we actually look at the entire year. We work back from the date we need to be good at. So working back from the date, when we look at last year, that means at the bottom of the calendar, we would have written March 2022, CrossFit Open and CrossFit quarterfinals. Those are the 2 peaking stages for our live, perform, compete athletes. And essentially what we do is we work backwards from there until we get to our present date, which would have been April, start the season. So I'm just going to take you through now, and if you can kind of envision all the months written down on a piece of paper. At the top, we have April, where we're just starting the season. At the bottom, we have March, which is where the season finishes. Think about working our way from the bottom all the way back up to the top. So just before the CrossFit Open, which of those training phases should we be spending time in? This is where we would be doing pre-competition work. A pre-competition training phase means that the training looks like or is preparing our athletes as much as we can for the actual open tests. So that means the structure of our week needs to look like the structure of how we would be actually going through the competition week. So that might look like easier days at the start of the week, harder days at the start of the week. And as a week gets closer to the Saturday or Friday where people do the open workouts, it gets a little bit easier. And then it's, of course, in the actual on the actual Friday or Saturday in the pre-comp phase, the workouts we need to be doing need to look similar to that of the actual CrossFit Open workouts. In terms of movement selection within a pre-competition phase, of course, the movements we need to be doing are based on the equipment lists or historical data from past CrossFit Opens, because there's no point in us doing other forms of training in that 4 to 8 weeks, because we have a very specific goal at that point, which is build confidence, improve technique and efficiency on the movements and the tests that we might see coming up. So for example, running, which historically has not been in the CrossFit Open, specifically long runs. We may see shuttle runs in 1 year. I've said that every single year and been proved wrong. But running is not something we'll typically see in the CrossFit Open. So in a pre-competition phase, we're not really doing any long running. Similarly, this year, they said that a rower would not be needed in in the CrossFit Open. So we decided to do a little bit less rowing. We still use it actually just to make sure that we're giving people a chance to develop their aerobic system with some lower eccentric movement. But generally speaking, we didn't focus on that as much. In terms of the intensity in a pre-competition phase, the intensity needs to be relatively high on certain days, because in the CrossFit Open, we're going to do high intensity workouts every time we actually hit one of these open tests. Some people may actually be doing the CrossFit Open workouts twice. Let's say someone who's really trying to qualify to quarterfinals and they're on the cusp of that top 10%. They may need to hit each workout twice, which means in their pre-competition phase, they need to be practicing doing a hard workout on a Friday and have the potential or the option to be doing a hard workout again on a Sunday or Monday. So in a pre-comp phase, we need to prepare people for that as well. So if we work backwards now, what we did about 8 weeks of a pre-competition phase. We didn't make it any longer than that, because pre-competition phases generally are quite taxing, because the intensity is higher. If your recovery protocols, which, let's be honest, most people following our programs aren't living the life of an elite athlete, so they have other stresses on their plate, which is going to take away from their ability to actually recover and adapt from their training. So we picked 8 weeks. Of course, some programs, some coaches may decide to make that longer. Some may actually decide to make that shorter. So many things, so many individualized components go into that. So what do we do before a pre-competition phase? Well, pre-competition phase, we actually do what we call an intensification phase. In an intensification phase, that is where it's basically a bridging phase between accumulation work. When we talk about accumulation work, that means the training looks the least like the actual sport itself. So in general, lower intensity, maybe more strength or structural balance work, maybe a little bit more bodybuilding. We're breaking down the bigger movements into smaller, more manageable skill components, or broken down variations of the lifts or gymnastics movements. So if you think about what that looks like in terms of accumulation work, an intensification cycle is bridging the gap between that and a pre-competition phase. So the training, the weights, the loads are getting a little bit more sport specific. So for example, we may not be doing in an accumulation phase, we might be doing things like snatch balances to help work on our snatch. In an intensification phase, we're going to be doing snatches from the floor or light, moderate touch and go style snatches. So it's getting a little bit more sport specific. The intensity is starting to ramp up a little bit more from the accumulation phase. The volume might actually decrease a little bit in an intensification phase, because remember that volume and intensity are inversely related. So if we increase the intensity of our strength work or our conditioning work, the volume must go down. If we increase volume and intensity together, well, that's a pretty drastic increase in stress that the body has to be able to tolerate. So going back to our map, pre-competition, we go into an intensification phase, and we do that for 4 to 8 weeks. And before that, we're basically, from there until the start of the season, we're basically spending most of our time in accumulation and intensification phases. So now you have a general idea of what accumulation, intensification, pre-competition phases look like. My first bit of feedback was I think we spent a little bit too much time from April to December just doing accumulation work. So what I mean by that is that I don't think I exposed our athletes enough within the year to training that actually looks like the CrossFit Open or the CrossFit quarterfinals. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The reason we tend to lean towards doing more accumulation work is because it's a little bit healthier. It's a little bit easier on the body. It allows people to still be consistent with their training without having to take big breaks because they're feeling beat up or their joints are sore, or they just don't have the energy, or they're burning out, or motivation is decreasing. Generally, accumulation work is a lot easier on the body. I see accumulation work when we talk about CrossFit as building strong foundations, which would then later down the line allow individuals to express more intensity. So it is a really, really important phase. But the balancing act is making sure that you're not spending too much time in accumulation work, because what sometimes happens is you move into a phase of intensification where we start to do a little bit more crazy CrossFit, quote unquote. And the people who follow the program are like, wow, I have not done this shit in a really long time. And they start to feel out of touch with the intensity. They start to perhaps lose the ability to execute the more specific sport skills. And what it means is that, you need to it takes a bit longer to get back into the groove of intensification phases. So my first criticism of myself was that, actually I think we need to drip feed small, short phases of intensification work, even within the preseason, to make sure that people are still getting enough touches on CrossFit throughout the year. Now, in terms of, balancing accumulation and intensification work, I will generally, almost always, obviously, there's going to be exceptions to this, bias towards doing a 2-to-1 accumulation to intensification. So for every 2 cycles of accumulation work, we do 1 cycle of intensification work. Now, the further away from the season you are, you may increase that to more like 3 phases of accumulation work, 1 phase of intensification work. The closer you get to the season, you may go more to like a 2-to-1. But again, that's just leaning towards health. And remember that in a preseason phase, we want to be building strong foundations. That's exactly what we want. We want healthy, resilient bodies that are going to be able to handle higher doses of intensity as we get closer to the start of the season. So the next question was, okay, well, when do we actually build in these intensification cycles within the year? So what we decided to do as a team is every year at the Process Programming, we hold at least 1 online competition. So we open this online competition up for online subscribers, so people who are part of our community, or sometimes we actually open up to the entire world and say, if anyone likes to take part in this. It will look similar-ish to the CrossFit Open. It's an online competition. So what we decided to do is this year we've penciled in our date for our summer competition, which is the notorious Process Programming Summer Throwdown. And we've put that in to the calendar for August 2022. So folks, if you're listening and you're thinking, when's my next competition going to be? Something that's not going to be too much to commit to. I don't have to travel anywhere. I can still do it in the comfort of my own gym. And you're going to have a bunch of bloody good tests with a bunch of bloody good people. Then the Summer Throwdown is for you. That's going to be in August. So what we decided to do is use that as a way to practice competing. So in the whole process of learning to get better at competing, we need to also get better at executing the preparation work leading into a competition. So what we'll be doing before the Summer Throwdown, we'll be doing a little intensification phase and a little pre-competition phase just before that. So that's going to be, if the competition's in August, remember guys, we always work backwards from that date. Competition's in August. In July, we'll be doing a little 2 to 3 week intensification phase, followed by a little 1 to 2 week pre-competition phase. Then we're going to hit the Summer Throwdown, which is going to be most likely a 2-week competition, 4 events. And then we simply get back into accumulation work and start training. So that's exciting. I love intensification pre-comp phases because it allows me to get really creative with programming, break away from structure a little bit, and expose people to the mayhem of the sport of CrossFit. So let's work backwards from there again. We're starting to work towards the current date that we're in, which is kind of March, April time. What does our training look like before that intensification pre-comp phase in July? We're going to be doing accumulation work. We have set aside 16 weeks of focused training where the goal is going to be build some really strong foundations. So we'll be seeing plenty of bodybuilding, plenty of structural balancing work. We're going to get strong or build the foundations to allow us to get strong. We're going to use this as a period to hone in on some of our skills and positions and things like gymnastics and the Olympic lifts. In terms of our aerobic system, we're going to use this time to build a really big, strong, large aerobic base, which means longer durations at slightly lower intensities. At the end of that 6 weeks, I'm confident for those who've stuck with the program and we have really, really good buy-in and compliance from our people, we're going to have some pretty strong structures or some pretty enduring bases to allow us to have a really, really great 2022-2023 season. Now, going into the more nitty-gritty of things actually within the program or the way we look at how we structure the week, things that we could also improve and change. The feedback was generally we could do a lot more Olympic lifting within the week. Olympic lifting is definitely an important component of the sport of CrossFit. When we look at the actual tests of the 2022 CrossFit Open, we only really saw Olympic lifting kind of in the last workout. A thruster I wouldn't say is an Olympic lift, but of course you do have to clean that bar up in some way, shape or form, and you do have to do a push press in the overhead. So it kind of is an Olympic lifting movement, but actually we didn't really see any pure variations or even sport-specific variations of the Olympic lifts this year. With that said, Olympic lifting is really, really nuanced. It's a very fine, it's a movement that requires fine-tuning in terms of timing and skill set. And when we look at our community as a whole, what we generally have is a deficit in the amount of load that people can lift in their Olympic lifts, snatch, clean, jerk, relative to their levels of absolute strength. So that's a really specific consideration that we've made based on our community. So what I mean by that is that if we were assessing whether someone needs to work on improving their clean, let's say their squat clean 1 rep max, for example, the first question we have to ask is, well, of course, what is their current squat clean 1 rep max, but also what is their front squat? Generally speaking, let's say we have an individual who can front squat 100 kilograms for 1 repetition, and they can squat clean 90 to 95 kilograms for 1 rep. What that would show or exhibit is that this individual has a pretty good, in fact, a very good ratio of absolute strength speed, which is the Olympic lift, to absolute strength. So if we wanted to improve this individual's ability to clean more weight, we actually don't need to be doing more cleans. This individual will need to spend a little bit more time bringing up their front squat 1 rep max. And we can safely say that if we bring their front squat 1 rep max up, this individual will more than likely be able to increase their clean 1 rep max. So an assumption we're making with this individual is that they have, or they're able to do a squat clean with a high degree of technique and efficiency. Let's reverse that. Let's say we have an individual who can front squat 140 kilograms for 1 repetition, and they have a squat clean 1 rep max of 90 to 95 kilograms. Well, now we have a pretty big disparity between absolute strength and absolute strength speed. So what this individual will need to do is probably not focus on trying to get stronger, and instead this individual needs to spend a little bit more time probably honing in the skills and the craft of Olympic lifting by developing and improving things like positions, maybe mobility specific, or skills in the clean. They're going to be able to, over time, increase the amount they can clean because we know they have the strength and the foundations there to do so. So for those of you who are listening thinking, because I hear this every year, I need to get stronger this season, make sure you take yourself through that little process. Examine where your absolute strength is, examine where your Olympic lifts are, and decide what is the limiter, what is stopping you from lifting more weight in the clean. Is it strength, or is it maybe a skill, movement, mobility limiter? So what we have said though is that we do want to expose our live, perform, compete athletes to more skill-based Olympic lifting. This doesn't mean we're going to be doing heavy work throughout the week all the time, but we're going to do broken down variations of it, maybe a combination of heavy and lighter skill-based days. Currently, as it is, we basically clean and jerk, or a variation of that, on one day, and then we snatch on one day. So at different times of the year, you might be seeing a little bit more volume spread out throughout the week on those lifts. Now, one day that we have on our training week that stayed constant throughout this entire year is our Tuesday. Our Tuesday we call Aerobic Tuesdays, where the intention or the stimulus on an Aerobic Tuesday is to do medium to long bouts of work, trying to be as sustainable and repeatable as possible, which means that the intensity we're hitting these workouts at is not 100%. It is not falling on our backs at the end of the workout in a pool of blood, sweat and tears. It means finishing the workout, having plenty left in the tank, knowing that we've made a contribution towards that cardiorespiratory base. One part of feedback that I also critiqued myself on, but the team also were very much in agreement, was that I think we can actually include a little bit more variance on these Tuesday sessions. We spend most of the year on Tuesdays spending a lot of time with light loaded movements. Maybe that's bodyweight gymnastics or light dumbbells, sometimes a barbell, combined with monostructural exercise. So rowing, assault biking, rowing, C2 biking. But of course, that can get a little bit monotonous, and we decided that I think it's time this year to add a little bit more variance into it. Now, the reason we generally keep the Tuesdays a little bit easier is because our Monday and Wednesday training days, especially for Perform and Compete, are generally heavier training days. So when I say heavier, I mean obviously the loads are sometimes heavier, but also like the complexity and the skills means that it's going to be a heavier workout on the nervous system, are generally a bit heavier. So it's really important that we're breaking up the training week to be alternating between higher or harder training days and lower or moderate, easier training days to allow us to actually recover and not have to take big breaks in the training year. But with that said, if we wanted to create increased amount of variance, or maybe even make the Aerobic Tuesday sessions a little bit more challenging and start to increase or include things like more load on those Tuesdays, we could definitely do that, but it means that we're going to have to strip back on the intensity and the volume on the Monday and Wednesday. So rather than hard day on Monday, easy day Tuesday, moderately hard day on a Wednesday, we might go with something like a moderate day on a Monday, a moderate day on a Tuesday, and a moderate easy day on a Wednesday. So that allows us to basically spread the systemic demand throughout the week a little bit more effectively. A really, really important thing that I think we do a really good job at in the process program on those Tuesdays is if you're going to give more variance in an aerobic training session, it's really important that we're continuing to spend time educating our athletes on what the intended dose response should be for that workout. So what do I mean by that? Is that, you'll often see in the process programming, we give rep ranges and load recommendations for a lot of our sessions. We often don't just prescribe a rep or a load. The reason being is that we try to explain what the workout should feel like, maybe give an indication of what times or we're looking at for each interval or each set and how it should feel. And we give people the power to make their own decisions based on what that intended stimulus is to pick the appropriate loads, reps, movements, etc. That will continue to be a really, really important part of those Aerobic Tuesday sessions. Something we also do have as part of the process programming is we have accessory programs, which are included in all our programs. One of those accessory programs is called endurance. And so if we are going to start to increase the variance in our Aerobic Tuesday sessions, it means that our endurance accessory work is going to be leaning more towards monostructural work, which it generally does anyway, but that's going to give our athletes a chance to really, clock in time and volume on the monostructural machines. Next bit of feedback, looking at the Perform Compete program, something we've done for a lot of this year is that we've had our snatching on a Wednesday for our Perform Compete athletes. Now the reason we have this, I think it's important to explain the context here, is that for all of our training groups, we prescribe 5 training days in a week. On the days that are not training, we do give ideas on things like active recovery, but generally we have 5 structured training days within the week. Now, what that looks like for the Live program, they train Monday, Tuesday, they rest on Wednesday, they train Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and they rest on Sunday. Our Perform Compete athletes, they train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they rest on Thursday, and then they train on Friday, Saturday, and they rest on Sunday again. The reason we put snatch work on a Wednesday, generally speaking, is because Wednesday is the priority day for our Perform Compete athletes. What I mean by that is because the program has also run a lot of affiliates. On the Wednesday, we focus on movements that only our Perform Compete athletes do. So, with that said, things like snatching, things like muscle ups, things like high skill gymnastics generally fall on a Wednesday. But there is a problem with that, of course, because if we always do our snatching and our high skill gymnastics on a Wednesday, it generally means that those athletes have already done 2 training days before that, which means they're always going to come into that day feeling a little bit less fresh than perhaps if they were to do that workout on a Monday, where they have a Sunday rest day before it, or maybe a Friday where they have a Thursday rest day before that. So what we're going to be doing this year, we're definitely going to be changing up the days that we snatch for our Perform Compete athletes. So depending on what the training cycle is, what the block is, you will see movements move around in the week a lot more, just to make sure it feels we're giving individuals a chance to do these movements in a fresher state, or sometimes we might deliberately choose to do it in a more fatigued state, but essentially making sure they don't get too accustomed to doing a certain movement on a certain day. In the sport of CrossFit, when it comes to actual testing time, we have to be able to do all movements on any day, sometimes in back-to-back days. So we've got to build up the resilience to be able to actually do that. For our Live program, their priority day is a Thursday. What we mean by a priority day is that it's a day where we, in the training day, we do the things that they need the most. For our Live program, that is generally speaking hypertrophy, strength work, and continuing to make some small progressions with their aerobic system. But generally speaking, structural balance and strength work is the priority of the Live group. So on our Thursdays, that's pretty much what we do. With that said, as someone who is programming the block or the program who knows about strength and conditioning, I know that this is what they need the most from a longevity and from a health perspective. But at the same time, I also too totally do understand, and this is always the challenge of a coach, is making sure that we're always striking the perfect balance between doing what's most appropriate for the client, but also making sure that it's enjoyable and that it's fun. Sometimes when we're just doing structural balance work or broken down skill work, we lose the fun, the play, the enjoyment factor of training, and it can start to feel a little bit monotonous and repetitive. So this year, I'm going to make a better effort at trying to make sure we're keeping some variance on those Thursdays, whilst also touching on their structural balance and their strength priorities. So expect to see more things like skill work dripped into that program. We may even do some Olympic lifting, skill-based Olympic lifting work. There will, of course, still be structural strength, hypertrophy work, and you may even see some conditioning work in there. Those will be fun, those will be enjoyable, and of course, we'll still be hitting on the priorities. Something also we're going to do this year, because we've seen real progression in the capacity and the capabilities of our live athletes over the years. In terms of kipping, we don't do very much kipping in the live program. The live program does a lot of strict pull-up work and strict pressing work. The only kipping work we expose them to is the basics of how to complete a kipping knee raise, or we give progressions, kipping leg raise, or for those who have the strength, and there are prerequisites for all of these that we always remind our people, moving towards teaching them the toes to bar. We made the decision last year to expose them to this, because whilst you could argue and say, well, actually, Ed, I don't really see how kipping contractions are going to help someone excel at life, and I would actually agree in that. But it's also important that we're exposing individuals to increases in complexity, and we're challenging their nervous systems to be able to learn new movements. And essentially what a kipping movement is on a bar is a more dynamic variation of pulling. So, of course, we have a prerequisite. You're not going to be doing any kipping contractions, especially not things like kipping pull-ups, if you aren't able to hit our minimum prerequisites of strict pull-ups. But those who are able to hit those prerequisites, and within our live program, we have a lot of men and women who can now do multiple reps and sets of strict pull-ups. It's important that we give them the ability to progress their dynamic pulling work. So this year, we actually are going to teach kipping pull-ups in the live program, but there will be really, really clear prerequisites. So if you're listening to this and you're part of the live program, make sure you meet the prerequisites and don't skip the basics and try to move into the fancy, sexy stuff. Okay, strength, relative strength, which is being able to move your own body weight for multiple repetitions, is the most important thing as a prerequisite before getting into doing things like kipping on a bar. But for our live program, something exciting, and as coaches, we're super excited to include this in the program and help people unlock more skills, which they're going to be able to then move into a fatigue-based setting in the long term. Something that we love and that we're going to keep is every Saturday throughout the entire year, we do a Saturday tester. It's the last day within the training week, and it gives us a chance, no matter what the training cycle is, to expose our athletes to a bit of CrossFit. When we talk about CrossFit, we're now talking about including different variations, combinations of all the movements we see in the sport, breaking away from structure. So sometimes the Saturday testers have nothing to do with the actual training cycle, although we always factor in the training week and the training cycle. But what it allows people to do is practice their craft of actually competing. So for example, they get to, for most people, if they're doing it with other people, they get to have clear movement standards. They get to see a workout strategy video similar to what CrossFit will release every Friday. And they basically get to take themselves through the process of actually practicing the skill of doing workouts. What I will say is that the people who really took those Saturday tests as seriously in the year, so listened to the strategy video, understood the movement standards, practiced the movement standards, created their own strategies and executed it, filmed it and reviewed their strategies, those people generally were in a better position come the CrossFit Open to get the most out of their attempts. We will continue to keep Saturday testers. They're loads of fun. I know our community loves them, but we're definitely going to be giving people a little bit more variance in terms of time domain. Now, whilst we know that the CrossFit Open, and this is obviously based on last year, we knew that we needed to be good between the 10 to 20 minute mark. So a lot of our Saturday testers were programmed between the 10 to 20 minute mark. This year, we want to make sure that we're giving people a bit more variance. That may mean longer, but I think specifically, we definitely need to make sure we're going shorter. Obviously, shorter time domains in 10 minutes is going to mean intensity is going to be a lot higher. And we just need to make sure we're not giving people too much of that in the year, because that is taxing, it is stressful in the system. We want to make sure we're always leaning towards health. We may see more things like skill pieces added in on those Saturdays. So rather than just a metabolic conditioning session, you may see a piece of A work or a primer or a skill piece before it, or even maybe some Olympic lifting or a strength piece before going into the tester. That's going to give us even more variance with the programming. It's going to be fun. For our compete program, I think we need to be including a little bit more high skill gymnastics throughout the year. So we'll have some training blocks, for example, in accumulation phase, but we're not doing all that much in terms of high skill gymnastics. So it's important we don't completely step away from that. Maybe a Saturday tester gives us a chance to get touches on those movements so that when we do come back to training cycles later in the year where we'll focus on it, these individuals haven't not done the movement in, let's say, 2 to 3 months. They will have still got micro doses on a weekend. And something we'll continue to do is every 4 to 8 weeks, and we'll coincide this with the start or the end of a training cycle, we will be including some partner team workouts. Of course, if you're someone who trains solo in your gym and you're thinking, well, but I don't have a partner or don't have team members to do these workouts with, don't you fret. We will always give an individual variation of the workout. So that concludes reflections from the 2021-2022 season and what we're going to be changing this year coming up. We've already mapped out what the calendar is going to look like. Super excited to be sharing that with all of our athletes. New cycle will be coming out on the 11th of April 2022 for our Live, Perform, Compete and our elite subscribers. So if you're interested in being a part of it, now is a fantastic time to do it. If you have no interest in being a part of the process programming, still love you. And hopefully this episode gave you some food for thought when it comes to writing your own training programs for yourself or for your friends, or if you're a coach writing a group training program, hopefully it gave you some insight into the approach that we take when it comes to writing a training program. That's it from me, folks. Hope you enjoyed the episode.